Hello, NAS 4983. This is your instructor again, Amy Lyons-Ketchum. Today I am going to review the lecture slides for Module 1, What is Language Revitalization? If this PowerPoint ends up being a little bit longer, I'll break the video into multiple shorter videos covering everything. Remember that the questions for the Module 1 quiz come in part from this lecture. They come from the reading assignments for Module 1 and from the viewing resources that will be in the folder with this video. So let's talk a little bit about what is language revitalization. So a language revitalization, it's something that happens as the result of language shift. So language shift happens first, and then revitalization may or may not follow. So what is language shift then? Well, this is very simply just movement of a group of speakers from one language to another. And so this could be a actual physical movement, like a group of people move to a place where they have to start using another language. It can be the result of, quite a few different things. Globalization, so maybe it is not necessarily profitable or practical to use one language, and then they have to shift to another language. Nationalism can play a role in this. An example would be in Spain. So we think of Spanish as being one thing, but there's actually several different languages that in the country of Spain. And some of these languages are prioritized over others as part of the national identity. And so if you're a speaker of Catalan, then you are kind of discouraged from using Catalan in favor of Castilian, which is kind of what we think of as standard like Spanish. Colonialism plays a huge role in language shift. That is what we see here in the United States. The colonial government was forced speakers of non-English to abandon their heritage languages in favor of English. Sometimes it can be physically dangerous to be a speaker of a language, and we know this from the boarding school experience of many children, that they were punished and beat for using their native language. This happens in other places in the world as well, where speakers of a certain language or people are identified by being as certain cultural groups by being speakers of a certain language, and if that can be physically dangerous for them, and so they have to shift to use another language. And then cultural change can be a reason. Maybe colonialism isn't necessarily the driving force, but people in a certain area have chosen to use another language for a variety of reasons. So the goal of language revitalization is to reverse language shift. So language shift being the movement of a group of speakers from one language to another, and then revitalization is to move those speakers back to their first language. So there's when we talk about language revitalization, we're normally talking about threatened or endangered languages. And so let's define that. So Fishman, in his 1991 book, says a threatened language are languages that are not replacing themselves demographically. They have fewer and fewer users generation after generation, and the uses to which these languages are commonly put are not only few, but additionally they are typically unrelated to higher social status, prestige, or power, even with their own ethno-cultural community. So let's talk about that. So a threatened language It's a language that over time there's fewer and fewer users of that language. It didn't all disappear in one generation, but it's becoming less and less and less. And typically, there's not as many uses of that language in their society. And the uses that they do have are unrelated to higher social status. They're not considered prestigious languages, and they're not considered the language of power where they are. So Fishman created a scale. It's the GID scale. We will talk about this in Module 3. And he talks about 8 stages of defined language shift. And think of it like a Richter scale of language loss. Every level gets more and more intense, more and more severe at the higher levels. So if your language is at a 1, a 2, or a 3, you're in really great shape. If your language is in a 6, 7, 8, then you're in a really desperate state. And so his scale has all kinds of different traits that you'll find at that level. And like I said, we'll talk a lot more about this in Module 3. So it's a fact that languages have always died out. Michael Krauss, another linguist, says about 10,000 years ago, they were anywhere from 5,000 to 20,000 languages. And so if you kind of take the middle of that, about 12,000 if you wanted to be right in the middle. Right now, there's a little over 6,000 known languages, and most of those are endangered. In fact, in less than 100 years, at least half of these, and probably more, will have no more speakers. And this disproportionately affects minority populations. 500 plus North American languages were found before contact. There's a little under 200-ish today. And less than 25% of North American languages have speakers who are children. And when I say speakers, I mean very fluent, maybe not perfectly fluent, but very proficient speakers. And so when we talked about before, threatened being fewer and fewer users generation to generation, if you only have 25% of languages who have children who are speakers, then we are severely threatened because that next generation is not primed to continue the language. So what is lost when languages die? And I have to say right now, and we'll talk about this later, I really am uncomfortable saying die when it comes to languages. I was taught that languages that don't have any speakers are sleeping and they can be reawoken. Something is dead, and you can't do anything with it. But something that is sleeping can be reawoken. And a language is only truly dead when there's no one who knows anything about it anymore. So if you hear me kind of avoid talking about languages being dead, this is why. So what is lost when languages go away? Well, there's an entire cultural heritage and ethnic identity encoded into language. And languages also show us a lot about human cognition, how we think about things in the world. When you are a person whose mother tongue is gone, then you lose that feeling of prestige and power as that people have when something is their own, that there's something that they have control over. And languages often give us unique information about the history of specific groups of people and, again, how they see the world. And so there's all kinds of unique cultural knowledge that is lost. Things like place names, plant names, animal names, directional systems, counting systems, calendar systems, and worldview. And we'll talk about some of these more in depth, but very briefly, place names. So there's all kinds of place place names, especially throughout Oklahoma and North America and of course all over the world, that give clues about that place in the original language. And when that language is gone, you forget that maybe this was a place of importance to a group of people. Maybe this was considered a holy place. Maybe it was a place where food was grown. Maybe it's a place you should avoid for some reason. The same with plant names and the uses of different plants as food or medicine. The same with animal names and their importance. Directional systems. There is a language in Australia that doesn't have left or right, forwards or backwards. They always refer to direction with cardinal directions, so north, east, southwest. So you wouldn't say like I sat to the right of her. You would say I sat to the south of her, or the north of him. And it's a really interesting system that shows how important cardinal directions were to these people. If you think about it, if you're in the middle of the Australian outback, you would really have to know where you are and where you're going, because it's a very dangerous place. The same with counting systems. Some languages use something different than a base 10 system. And so, thinking of things 1 through 10 is not the only way to think of numbers in the world. Same with calendar systems. And so there's a lot of examples of how when languages go away, certain ways of thinking. There's a language in South America, the Amara language, where they conceptualize the past as being in front of a person and the future as being behind. And we here in English, we think of it as the complete opposite. We think as the past as being behind us and the future is ahead of us. And when asked, why do you see the past as being ahead of you, they say, because you can see the past, you can't see the future. And you can see what's ahead of you, but you can't see what's behind you. And it makes a lot of sense, and one way is not correct or wrong, but it's just different and interesting. And so a lot of those variations disappear. So what is gained then when languages are revitalized? So there's a lot of cognitive benefits of multilingualism, and if you click on this link, you'll be able to see. We'll bring it up right now. Kind of talking about the benefits of bilingualism. And so here's a supplemental resource. What are some of the benefits? Increased brain power, academic advantage, increased awareness of other cultures, competitiveness in the job market. Once you've learned a second language, learning third, fourth, fifth languages becomes incredibly more easy. It's kind of like if you think about your brain as a hard drive and you've partitioned your hard drive. We have English on one side and language 2 on the other side. It's much easier to partition other languages in there. You do actually have more mental capacity for longer in your life. And they've actually shown that people who speak 3 or more languages have very few incidences of Alzheimer's disease. And they believe that the reason is because you have so many connections in your brain that as connections start to fail, you have backup connections that can continue thought processing. So there's a lot of benefits to multilingualism. It's a critical link to culture and identity and the divine, especially for a lot of Native American people. It does have improved academic performance for youth. Again, it goes back to creating more neural pathways in your brain. People who speak multiple languages tend to be better at math and better at music, and they believe that those skills are in a similar part of the brain. And so as you develop one of them, like speaking multiple languages, you're increasing blood flow and neural pathways to that part of the brain, which in part makes math and music easier. In fact, quite a few linguists are actually musicians. I was a musician before I was a linguist, but I could see it there. And sovereignty. So if you're a native person, it is extremely important that your language stay alive and be strong and identifiable, because in the future, there is a possibility that the government will look at Native people and say, how are you any different from the rest of citizens in the United States? And the most obvious thing you can point towards is your language, culture and religion and those things too. But the biggest thing that you can point to that would set you apart and make you different is your language. And if you do not have that, then it becomes a more complicated argument. So it's critical for sovereignty of Native tribes that their languages are strong, and that there's a lot of evidence that they do things in their languages. So the other links on here are really interesting. So, possible reduced recidivism for prisoners. So, what this means is that there were a group of Hawaiian prisoners that continued to have trouble and get in jail. And so, a program that they did in their jail, and a lot of times, if you're a native Hawaiian, you get sent to the mainland United States to go to jail, because there's just not a lot of room in Hawaii to build prisons. And so you're being physically removed from your family. You can't necessarily have people come visit you. It's a really desperate situation. However, they, at a prison on the mainland United States, they had a cultural program just for Native Hawaiians, where they learned their language and about their culture and traditional eating. And it really built a lot of confidence in these men, and it built a lot of pride in their identities. And they saw that over time, the people who participated in these programs were far less likely to return to prison. And I think it would be very interesting to see if similar kind of programs worked here in Oklahoma. We know that Native people are incarcerated at higher rates, and so to see if Native cultural programs in the prison help reduce that recidivism and returning to prison, and kind of give hope to people that there's other things that they can do with their life. And then learning your language, it can be an act of political resistance. It really is a way to set yourself apart, to protest against policies of your government. You see this in Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland technically is part of the United Kingdom. It is not part of the Republic of Ireland, and there has been violence and conflict, honestly, for centuries, but definitely throughout most of the 1900s, all the way through the 1990s, about cultural identity in Ireland. And a lot of people who were imprisoned for resisting or acting out against the British state learned the Irish language in prison as part of their resistance against the British government. And it was extremely powerful for them and meaningful. And some people resisted with hunger strikes, other people resisted with activism, and then a lot of people resisted by learning their heritage language and refusing to speak English to the jailers. And it was very powerful for them. So these are some of the things that are gained when languages are revitalized. So language revitalization is a lot more than just classes in a language. And that might seem surprising that, we just need some classes. It's actually a lot more complicated than that. So it really starts with language planning, which is just what it sounds like, a organized agenda for or a plan for a language. So if we want to revitalize our language, how are we going to do that? And we're going to have classes. Okay, for what age? Are we going to have adult classes, children classes? Are we going to have classes in the public schools? Are we going to have private classes? Are we going to pay our teachers, or are they going to be volunteers? If we're going to pay our teachers, how are we going to pay them? How are we going to train them? Are we going to pay our students, or are they just going to be volunteers? What different kinds of materials are they going to use in their classes? Are we going to standardize spelling? Are we going to show or use this dialect of our language versus this dialect in our classes? So, language planning is really exactly what it sounds like, having an organized plan for how you want to revitalize your language. Language policy, on the other hand, is the theories, principles, laws, programs, measures, and acts designed to manage one or more languages in a country. And so language policy would be government acts or government laws about language policy. For example, if you had a native language teacher in the public schools in Oklahoma, normally a public school teacher has to be certified and they have to have at least a bachelor's degree and they have to go through certain training. A native language teacher would still have to go through a certification process. However, if the tribe recommends this person to be a language teacher, they're exempt from things like having to have a bachelor's degree or other things. They would just have to be able to pass the standard background check. And that's because it is seen as specialized knowledge. And that is protected by the Esther Martinez Native American Languages Act. So there's different laws and policies and different things through the government that you can do as part of your language revitalization, and this is language policy. Preservation work is something that I do a lot when it comes to language revitalization, and so this is work to prevent a language from being becoming unknown to future generations. So sometimes jumping straight into classes is not the best plan for different language groups. Instead, sometimes it's important to gather as much information about the language as possible. So that could be, that could be trying to find archives materials. That could be trying to find recordings that have already been done. That could be just doing information in the community talking about different things in the language. So, for example, making handouts or making a little booklet in the language. So, maybe doing a full-on language lesson is not where you want to start. Maybe you have to gather information first. Maybe you have to do some documentation and description. So this is recording written and audio of sounds, vocabulary, structures, phrases, stories, and uses of a language. So maybe it's sitting down with elders and just talking, having them talk in the language and recording it and then translating it so that we can use those in lessons down the line. Maybe your elders don't really have the patience or good health to be able to be teachers, and so you just need to get as much language from them as possible so that you can train other people to be teachers to actually give the classes. Language renewal is increased usage of a language, including creation of new language to fit modern situations. For example, how do you say computer in your language? How do you say cell phone in your language? Chances are there might not be a way to say that, and you have choices. You could use the English word, which is probably not the best choice, but you could. You could make up a new word, or you could repurpose an old word. For example, in some languages, the word for wagon is the word for car. They've just repurposed an old word that's probably not going to be used nearly as much. Language awakening is working to create new speakers of language with no living fluent speakers. So I talked about sleeping languages. This is awakening languages, and there's a lot of high-profile examples of language awakening. The largest and probably most known worldwide is Hebrew. At one time, there were no first language speakers of Hebrew. There were just people who knew it, kind of like people know Latin as a dead language. But with the creation of the country of Israel, Hebrew became the national language, and there's a lot of effort to revitalize Hebrew and to create new words in Hebrew to talk about modern situations. And now there's millions of people that Hebrew is their first language. Example from North America would be the Miami language, and we'll talk about that later in the class. Language maintenance is continued use of a language in the face of a competing language. So, for example, English is always going to be the dominant language, but there's no reason that you can't continue to use your native language in your home, in certain cultural spaces and things like that. Intergenerational transmission is when a language is passed from an older generation to a younger. So that's parents speaking to their kids, grandparents speaking to their grandchildren, just making sure that the young people have the language. Now, a lot of people think, if we're going to have language classes, we need to do it for the kids. And absolutely, you need to. But it does nothing if the parents of those kids don't continue the language at home. So you really need that intergenerational transmission. You need parents to learn the language so they can talk to their kids. Because if the parents only talk to their kids in English, it's not going to stick. The kids will learn a lot, but it's not going to stick in the same way. When you think of your mother, you think of a certain language, and so if your mother speaks to you in your native language, you're really going to have a strong emotional tie to your native language. If it's just the nice lady who teaches the language class, you're still going to learn language and enjoy it, but you're not going to have that strong emotional tie. All right, that's my soapbox for today. So language planning, there's a macro level, like a national government, and a micro level, so on the community. So that could be things like different laws that have been passed, which we'll talk about when we talk about language policy and planning, that protect native languages in the United States and around the world. At the micro level, it could just be, your tribal council passing a resolution to say, how important the language is. So it's official agencies, measures taken by official agencies to influence the use of one or more languages in a particular community. When it comes to language policy, here's some of the language policy for North America and in other countries as well. The 1990 Native American Languages Act, the Official Languages Act is Canada's version. The Education Amendment, Chinese language policy, language in education policy in South Africa, and Irish language policy. So if you click on these links, you can learn more about the different language policies around the world. I highly recommend you do. When it comes to documentation and description, so there's things like language archives. Documentation can be done from on paper, or it can be done in online dictionaries like Flex and Elan. It can be done through transcription, audio recording, which is something I do a lot of. Back in the day, it was on wax cylinders, but now we have highly sensitive microphones and different ways to record. And then when we talk about description, this is more linguistic jargon, talking about the structure of a language. So documentation is really important for revitalization. Description is more important to linguists and academics. So this is like talking about noun phrases and verb prefix and, structure, like syntax, which really doesn't mean anything to speakers or necessarily to learners, but kind of is more important to linguists. But documentation and description go hand in hand. So language renewal. So, like I said before, how do we talk about things like computers, electricities? Do you have rules for word formation? So in English, we pretty much have no rules. We can do anything to make new words. But maybe in your language, there's specific ways that words get created. And so if you know those rules, then you can make any words you want. You can borrow words from English or from other languages, like neighboring, like maybe your language, no one really knows how to talk about a certain fruit, but a related language calls it this. Well, then you can borrow that word from them. Some language communities have committees where elders and learners and people who work in the language program get together and discuss how to make new words. My friend Carly is Muskogee Creek, and she said pretty much when they would get a request on how to say a word, that the Mahayas, the teachers, the elder women who ran the language program, would just sit and argue about it until they came to a consensus, and say, oh, I'd never say it like that, or I would say it like this. The most important thing, though, for language renewal is community buy-in. So getting the community on board that this is important and this is something we all need to do, and actually show up to do it. And then the more that you can increase the use of the language in a modern setting, the more relevant it is to the community. So using it on social media, seeing it in news, art, film, poetry, and making it the language of choice for a group of people, instead of something they have to do, but something that they want to do. And this picture has Finding Nemo in Navajo. So making the language relevant to the community. With Language Awakening, that's me with Miss Becky Barnett from the Muskogee Creek Language Program at a program called the Breath of Life program. So here again, talking about dead languages, I don't like it. Something dead is not to be touched or used. I prefer the term sleeping. I did not coin this term, but this is what I was taught, and something that's asleep can be awakened. A sleeping language has no fluent first language speakers. There can be first language speakers that have a lot of language but not necessarily fluent, speakers, second language speakers who have quite a bit of the language but are not fluent. And then when awakening a language, use documentation of the language and related languages to create new speakers. And then I have some links to talk about Mia, Hebrew, and Nachi, different languages that are technically sleeping languages that have been reawoken. So with language maintenance, it's really trying to keep your language relevant, so that it is not abandoned for a colonial language. And so this could be because of, again, colonialization, immigration, economic issues. There's quite a few people from Central America who have moved to the United States. We think of them as Spanish speakers, but they most likely speak an indigenous language of Central America. Spanish is their colonized language. And then when they come to the United States, they have to rely either on Spanish because, when we think of people from south of Texas, we think that they all speak Spanish, which is not necessarily true. Or they're, forced to learn English, and they don't want their children to be behind here in the United States, so they prioritize English over their indigenous language. And so it's maintenance really a conscious effort to use or maintain a minority language. And then when it comes to intergenerational transmission, we're talking about passing on the language from one generation to the next. And this is the language of the home. It requires parents to speak to young children in the language, and it does not rely on school or other outside influences. And this is by far the most effective means of transmission, is starting young with kids and them hearing the language from their parents and their family and their loved ones. They'll learn English. You don't have to worry about that. There's just so much English all around them, but the more of their language, their endangered language, you can get to them at a younger age, the more likely they are to be fluent. And then if they hear it from family members, people that they love and trust, they will grow that bond and feel the need to speak that language to their children. So, what role do linguists play in language revitalization? And it can be really controversial. So, what is the role of the linguist? So, for some linguists, it's just to document, just to write down, to take down the words. For others, it's to be an archivist, so to take that documentation and other people's documentation and put it somewhere safe where it can be accessed by people who need it. Some linguists really see themselves as an advocate and someone who is fighting for the use of these endangered languages. And then that can become an activist, someone who is helping to change laws and change attitudes. I think that linguists should definitely be an ally, but not all necessarily are. Some linguists end up becoming language teachers. I've met quite a few through my work with the Language Conservancy who end up teaching the language to different groups. I work as a consultant, so I share the knowledge I know about language teaching and language learning with different tribes and different groups so that they can benefit from that knowledge and find the plan that works best for their program. Should a linguist be a language program director if there's no one in the community that is willing to or able to work with the language? Can a linguist fill that role? Personally, I don't think they should, but in some situations, there's no one else who will. I can see why it's happened. And then one thing that I personally am always vigilant against is making sure that the linguist is not seen as a savior. So a lot of times you'll read an article, and I'm sure it's a well-meaning article, talking about how some linguist is saving languages, and that is by no means what is going on or should be promoted. But it makes a good headline and it makes a good clickbait, and it really sends the wrong message. This movie, The Linguist, you will read, I think, or do in unit 3 or 4. And you'll watch this movie and do a reflection over it. And it's about two linguists who work with different endangered language communities, are really racing to document languages that only have literally like 1 or 2 speakers that are very, very elderly. And so talking about that, like, language savior, it says a fascinating journey with 2 men who are the Indiana Joneses of language hunters. And so it's really glamorizing what they do. And I think what they do is very important, but at the same time, I think this misrepresents it. So it's very interesting. So Language Revitalization Oklahoma, you should be able to click on all of these links. So if you don't already know, the Oklahoma Native American Youth Language Fair is the largest revitalization program for school-age children in the state. Breath of Life is a national program. We had an Oklahoma version of it where different groups came and learned how to use archival material in their revitalization work. The Oklahoma Workshop on Native American Languages was out of Tahlequah. I don't know if this is still going, but this was, really just a place where people working in language revitalization come together and share what works, what doesn't work. Of course, there's tribal language programs throughout the state. There are K-12 classes throughout the state. There are immersion schools like the Cherokee School. The University of Oklahoma has a Native American Languages department as part of the Sam Noble Museum. And then, of course, there's the Native American Studies program at OU and East Central University. East Central University's Nasanti program has done so much to help revitalize languages, and they are one of the sponsors of this class. This year, they're having Choctaw, Kiowa, Potawatomi, and Chickasaw at ECU. And then the University of Arts and Sciences, Oklahoma, their Nasanti program, so that's the school in Chickasha, their Nasanti program did a whole Kiowa archive and website that's really, really interesting. Across the U.S., like I said, there's a National Breath of Life program. The Miami Center is a kind of national resource for language revitalization. You have the Endangered Language Project, the Smithsonian Institute Center for Folklife, which has the Mother Tongue Film Festival, and then there's tribal language departments across the country. There is in the works a national language fair based on the Oklahoma language fair that's going to happen in Washington, D.C. I will be there no matter what. I've worked for the Oklahoma language fair since 2012, I think, so I can't wait for the D.C. one. It's going to be amazing. And then abroad, the United Nations does a lot. So you might have heard of the Decade of Indigenous Languages from UNESCO. We're doing that right now. Different languages across the world have done a lot of work. The Irish language in Nepal, the Ainu of Japan. Catalan is one of the languages of Spain. That has a really political uphill battle. Occitan was a language that was over like a good chunk of Southern Europe, and learning about the Occitan language was the first time, and I was in early high school, that opened my eyes that political maps are not necessarily linguistic maps. And it's a really interesting language. And you also have the Maori, who are famous for their work in New Zealand. So there's a lot of great resources here. I have some citations here if you're interested in some more information about what is language revitalization. And if you have any questions, concerns, feel free to reach out to me. And I look forward to talking to you again in Module 2. Bye.